Welcome, Anthem. Thank you so much for joining us again for another one of our online services. I'm Sandy Wild, and I'm here with our pastor, Buddy Holden.
Thank you, Sandy.
You betcha.
Anthem, we wanted to not only welcome you, but try to keep you as updated as possible. As you know, so many things are changing in our world, which probably has great lessons to learn, but is also kind of annoying. One of our changes is after speaking with our elders and trying to get a full complement of volunteers with our 2 worship services, what we're finding is it will work best with our body and congregation to offer one service moving forward live. And so we will be moving to a live one service at 10 a.m. starting on June 7th. We will also simultaneously be live streaming those services. So for those of you who don't feel as though it's time yet to worship in person, we want to respect that and want to provide that venue for you. It will be live at 10 a.m. The 31st of this month will be a transitionary Sunday. We will be offering online services only, but it will be a true live stream service, so it will be available at 10 a.m. that Sunday morning. We look forward to worshiping with you, not only electronically on your devices, but absolutely seeing you guys again and being able to worship in the same room. It is just something that brightens our hearts, and we look forward to that. So we will see you then, Anthem. Bye.
Nothing can separate, even if I ran away. Your love never fails. I know I still make mistakes. You have new mercy for me every day. Your love never fails. You stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. And when the oceans rage, I don't have to be afraid, because I know that you love me. Your love never fails. The wind is strong, the water's deep. I'm not alone here on these open seas. Your love never fails. The chasm is far too wide. I never thought I'd reach the other side. Your love never fails. No. You stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. And when the oceans rage, I don't have to be afraid, because I know that you love me. Your love never fails. Your love never fails. You make all things work together for my good. You make for my good. You make all things work together for my good. You make all things work together for my good. You make all things work together for my good. You make all things work together for my good. You stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. And when the oceans rage, I don't have to be afraid, because I know that you love me. Your love never fades. Worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever stay. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song, this cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when striving cease, my comforter, my all in all. Here in the love of Christ I stand. Ground, his body lay, the light of the world by darkness slain, then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again. And as he stands in victory, since curse is lost its grip on me, for I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. Guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no schemes of man can ever pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. He returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back.
Good morning, Anthem, and welcome back to another weekend worship service. I am just so truly looking forward to worshiping with you guys again, to be able to communicate the Word of God to you live, not towards lights with a camera, but to real people. And I hope you guys are as excited about that as I am. Today we continue in the series of David after God's heart. Today is kind of another bummer season in the life of David. We will be covering the entire chapter of 2 Samuel chapter 11, and it is just rough. It is another godless chapter. It is probably the most well-known sin in the Bible, with potentially the one exception of Adam and Eve's fall. Everyone knows about David and Bathsheba, and so hopefully we can cover this text. It can still be applicable, even if we might be overly familiar with it. Oftentimes our society is very impressed by and enamored with people who start in rags and end with riches. The internet is full of all sorts of useless stuff, as I generally weekly remind you. And one of those things that it is chock full of is lists of people who began with nothing and ended with everything. People who began looked down upon and ended as some of the most influential and affluent people of history. Among those are some pretty famous people. I think of Vincent van Gogh, a very famous artist and a man who in his lifetime is only known to have sold one painting worth only 400 francs, and now his paintings are selling for over $80 million per piece of artwork. Another famous individual is Oprah Winfrey. Oprah was fired from her first TV anchor job because she, quote unquote, was too emotionally invested in her stories. Oprah has obviously capitalized on that, and she is now so affluent that Forbes daily tracks her net worth, which is hovering a little bit over $2.5 billion today. Another prime example would be Walt Disney, who was fired from a creative job because he, quote unquote, lacked the imagination and creativity to fulfill his roles. And as we know, Walt Disney went on to found an empire based on his imagination and the creativity of his and of many others. And on and on and on the lists go. Albert Einstein always makes an appearance of being told by his teachers he was too stupid to learn anything, by being fired from employers because he just couldn't keep up with people, and then he goes on to prove himself to be one of the most ingenious humans of all time. We could go on and on and on about this, and our society loves that. We love examples of people who start out low and end real high, but what is actually really, really hard to find in our society and on that internet is lists of people who made it big and who lost it all, who screwed up, who gave it all up in a moment's foolishness. We don't like those stories where they start great and end poor. This is exactly what we see here in the life of David. It's cringeworthy. It kind of sets your teeth on edge, but as we will see, it is always worth a quick dive into a sober assessment of ourselves. The story doesn't exist to make David look like a fool, but rather the story exists, in my opinion, to continue to serve as a cautionary tale to God's people. Let's dive in. 2 Samuel 11 begins by saying, "In the spring of the year, when kings go out to battle." This cracks me up, Anthem. Back then, as I have told, and I kind of stumble over my words and kind of just peter out with the word gnarly, David and his dudes were gnarly. They were fine and just unflinching when it came to just extremely personal, in-your-face, close quarters, hand-to-hand combat. Was no big deal for them. They entered into these engagements very regularly, with practically no thought to their well-being. But we do know that was dangerous. That was obviously life-threatening, and if you didn't have the grace to die quickly on the battlefield, you were in for a very long and miserable death without any modern medicine to help save you. And so it's so funny to think of these men, some of the toughest that I can imagine, yet when it came to the rainy seasons of winter, when it came to cold and wet and rain and mud, these manly men were like, yucky. And they just didn't fight half the year because they didn't want to be wet and cold and muddy, which is just so inconceivable for me. So it's that time of year. It's just ended. It's now time to get back to those battle scenes. Said that David had sent Joab, who was his military commander, and his servants with him and all of Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and they besieged Rabbah. And so it's a normal year, kind of a normal springtime. They re-engage in military commands. They're kind of picking up these long-standing battles with the enemies of Israel. And just in the interim between kind of the Mephibosheth instance that we talked about last week and how we dive into David and Bathsheba this week, Israel has fought the war with the Ammonites, and Joab has led the army out. David stayed behind that time also, and Israel was unable to obtain a decisive victory, only until David kind of got off his rear end and engaged in the battle as he ought to have been as Israel's chief in command. And only with David's leadership and assistance is Israel able to establish a very dominant, overwhelming victory against her enemies. It's as if David ought to have known better by this point. He's learned the lesson of staying behind when the army goes out, but he's doing it one more time. This chapter, it is very full of open spaces for imagination. So much has been talked about and written and filmed about this particular instance that it's hard to keep ourselves on track with the biblical narrative and not err into hypothesizing about what was really happening, what could have actually been going on in David's heart, what maybe were the motivations behind Bathsheba. Frankly, we don't know, and that really is a pitfall of trying to read into the text too much. What we do know is David should have learned this lesson already about staying behind and that it will bring him some very serious consequences. It says at the end of that paragraph in my Bible, it says, David remained in Jerusalem. David here is willfully self-isolating. We will see that there's very high consequences to that, which will come upon him nearly immediately. And he's very vulnerable, not because he's sick or he's weak or his enemies are overwhelming, but quite the opposite. David is vulnerable because he's riding upon the wave of success. Most people agree David would be in his 40s, maybe even in his 50s at this point. His leadership is dominant. His rule has been established. His enemies are being eradicated. David is famous. He is popular. His ratings are through the roof. And so he's just taking some time for himself. His kind of at the peak of his life where leisure and safety and pleasure are kind of what he's all about. He's not really fully fulfilling his duties, but he's just kind of resting upon his victories or his laurels. And this is going to get him in trouble. It says that late one afternoon, when David rose from the couch, he was walking on the roof of the king's house. That word late afternoon means twilight or evening. So it's time to go to bed. There's no electricity. People went to bed with the sun and rose with the sun. And so it's bedtime. David has spent all day relaxing and living in pleasure and leisure, and yet it's not satisfying him. He should have been the most content man in Israel, and yet what we see is he can't sleep. He is apparently facing restless leg syndrome because those words of him walking on the roof, it's a duplicate double word. He's walking, like he's pacing back and forth. He's agitated either in body or in spirit. He's not finding the rest and the contentment that he had hoped to find by staying behind. And what we're realizing is that by seeking self-gratification, instead of doing what he ought to do as a king, by seeking self-gratification, David is not finding the satiation that he desired. He's not being fulfilled in these what look to be pretty decent situations as a king. So he's walking on the roof, and it says, he saw from the roof, a woman bathing. Now, in this particular instance, David is not explicitly sinful. He's making foolish choices. He's not doing what he should. He has isolated himself from his advisors and his military commanders and his close friends known as the mighty men of David. He's all by himself. It's evening time. He's on his roof. He apparently incidentally sees a woman bathing. Again, he's done nothing wrong necessarily. It's inappropriate because he's seeing more of a woman than he ought to. And he has every opportunity here to forget about it, to bounce his eyes, to walk away, to flee from sin as he should. And we'll get to that later. But David here has a world of opportunity to avoid the calamity that's coming upon him. And David so foolishly doesn't take hold of the opportunity to walk away, to look away, to ignore the temptation that has presented itself before him in his innocence. It is interesting to watch this digression of David here. It continues and it says that the woman was very beautiful. The Bible discusses the details and the names of very many women throughout Scripture, and only 3 women receive this title or moniker of very beautiful. We can know by this the Bible is not exaggerating. It's just saying like this was a woman to behold. And so by understanding this, we know that David's not bouncing his eyes. David's eyes are lingering. They are feasting upon a vision that is inappropriate for him to see. David is dwelling and he's allowing the flesh, his more primal senses, he's allowing them to become inflamed. He's recognizing that this woman she's a looker. She's apparently his type. He finds much beauty in her. And so this isn't an accidental oops glance and David's innocent. This is an oops glance, oh, mama. Like he's starting to stare, get googly-eyed, get kind of brain dead, as men often do in these situations. And he's staring upon the naked or semi-naked body of a woman. And quite clearly, this is beginning to turn into sin as David dwells upon it. It's interesting for further research and study. I encourage you guys to read this week Proverbs chapter 7. It's a story about a young man kind of being enticed by an adulteress and how that ends so poorly for him in his destruction. And though that's not perfectly analogous to what is happening here, we really can't speak of the motivations of Bathsheba. What we can learn from Proverbs 7 is it seems as if there's a time when we are confronted with sin and with temptation, and though it is a strong pull in our lives, and though our flesh and our body might resonate very strongly with it, we are always given an opportunity to look away, to walk away, to flee from the scenarios that could lead to our destruction. Oftentimes, I think of it in the terms that was painted to me as a young man, that sin oftentimes is like wading into a shallow, slow-moving river. We can walk into it fully confident in our ability to exit at any time, and yet we want to engage. We want to enjoy the pleasures of being in the river. And as we lose ourselves in those pleasures, what we don't notice is that slow-flowing, shallow river, it begins to pick up pace and turning into more of a raging torrent than anything else. And it leads to our destruction. There's always this waterfall at the end of being swept up in pleasure and passion and sin. It will always lead to our destruction. It always begins with opportunities and ways out, and with us having the ability to exit. But at some point, as we will see with the life of David, it ends in us being swallowed up by the passions and the current of sin, and leading to the point where we can't stop, we can't get out, and we are led to our destruction. This, again, serves as a cautionary tale for us. So David continues looking upon, and he goes even further, and he inquires about this woman. He's beginning to slip. He's beginning to think, what if? Why can't I have her? After all, I'm the king, and I kind of deserve this, and my life is about pleasure and leisure and safety and comfort right now. It's all self-focused. And so he begins to wonder, why can't I have this woman also? And so he sends and inquires about her. And one said, so a messenger, a servant of David, someone in his employ, speaks to David. And reading between the lines, this person is trying to the absolute boundaries of their permissible authority. They're trying to warn David of the impending doom and sin. And yet you just can't call your king and Lord out upon blatant sinning. You've got to sort of work within the boundaries given. And that's exactly what is done here. The person says, is she not Bathsheba? Bringing personhood to this naked form. She's a woman, David. She is an image bearer of God. She has a name, and she has a life, and she has passions, and she is more than just her naked form. She exists for so much more than just to exist as an object for your gratification. And this is as if this person's trying to shake David out of his momentary insanity and bring David back to sober judgment. Making it worse, at least making David's thought process worse, the person goes on and says, she is the daughter of Eliam. This man David knew. He is listed as one of David's close military friends, a mighty man of David. David had fought with and alongside this man against the enemies of Israel. He would have known this man by name. He had fought bloody battles with this man. And whoever this unnamed servant was is like, not only is this a woman with more to her life and being than just your gratification, David, like she's part of the upper crust of the society of Israel. She's part of the upper class, and you know her dad, and you've worked with him before, and if he would have known that she was the daughter of Eliam, he would have been able to extrapolate. She's also the granddaughter of Ahithophel, David's trusted advisor. Like, David, you're surrounded by her family. She's not just a nobody here. You esteem and look up to the advice and wisdom of her grandfather. You fight along and are friends with her father, and she, even without those two other relationships, is a person worth dignity. Continuing on, oh, by the way, she's also the wife. Yeah, like, yoo-hoo, she's married. Like, this should be a deal breaker here. She's the wife, and not just nobody's wife. She's the wife of another one of your warriors, another mighty man of valor, Uriah the Hittite. David would have personally known this man, again, fought alongside this man in many a battle for several decades. These are no strangers to David. This is so wrong on so many levels for David to continue to lust after the body of this woman, to just abuse her so that she can be an object of gratification rather than recognizing this comprehensive view of her personhood. And isn't it so frustrating that, particularly as men, and particularly in instances of sexual fidelity and purity, we are so often given to just idiotic cessations of thought. We don't think through things. We just want gratification. We just want pleasure. We just want to feel good. We don't care who it is. We don't care why it's wrong. Too often, we allow ourselves to fall into these ruts of sin that drag us ever closer to destruction, where we are promised ecstasy and pleasure and all of the benefits of living out these lustful desires of our flesh. And maybe it's not sexual sin, maybe it's something else, but the initial attraction to sin, it always promises the best. It never delivers on those, and it simultaneously never fully discloses all of the pain and anguish and heartache and collateral that come with our decisions to sin. If we, and if David could sober up, if someone could slap us into sobriety during those moments, so much sin would be avoided. So much heartache in our world would just simply cease to exist if we could think through fully, not just the pleasure, the momentary pleasure of sin, but the permanent consequences of sin also. Unfortunately, David, as we often, so many of us do, he's not really thinking. He's not thinking through the consequences. And it says, so David sent messengers and he took her. He takes her as if she's an object, as if she is a toy of a child that's picked up when they want to have fun and cast away when something new catches their eye. David just treats her as if she's an object. He robs her of her dignity, of her personhood, of her standing in society, and he just boils her down to something that can make him feel good upon his demand. He takes her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. And so the deed is committed. And oftentimes we as believers, we want to gloss over, David had an affair, it's really bad. And we don't really dwell upon the ignominy, the awfulness of our sin. And that's to our detriment, Anthem. David ought to have known, like, you have to understand, you are dishonoring an image-bearing person of Jesus Christ. David, you are boiling humanhood down to an object for your gratification. David, you need to understand that you committed adultery. You had sex with a married woman. Like, let's use some real strong language here. This is actually what happened. Let's not gloss over and be like, well, unfortunately, David had moral compromise and let's move on. Like, sin is ugly. And when we try to make it look less ugly, we do ourselves a disfavor. A quote that has meant a lot to me this week. It says this. It says, we often fail in the battle against sin because we don't call it for what it is. Sin is lawlessness. It is an offense against the great lawmaker who is God. Call it for what it is. Sin is lawlessness. The first step towards holy living is to recognize the true nature and the wickedness of sin. Said by the old pastor John Stott, and how appropriate it is that we oftentimes, just as we see David doing here, we're enamored with the pleasure and the initial promise of sin. We refuse to look upon the consequences of sin. We won't call it for what it is. And in doing all of that, we fall into lawlessness. But if we can recognize how abhorrent the lawlessness within us is, we will flee from it as we should, as David ought to have done all along. There's this odd, uncomfortable footnote that says now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanliness. Well, that's a weird factoid. Why do we need to know about the menstruation cycles of Bathsheba? That's super awkward. It's this footnote to let us know, like, unequivocally, Bathsheba was not pregnant before this happened, and definitely, Bathsheba was pregnant after this happened. There's only one option, and it is the fruit of the sin of David and Bathsheba. So it says, Bathsheba returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and she told David, I'm pregnant. Houston, we've got a problem here. Like, I don't know what David thought when she went away. Maybe he thought he as king deserved it as one of the perks and privileges. Maybe he tried explaining to himself how this could maybe be permissible. Maybe he just tried to cover it up and hoped no one, including obviously Uriah the Hittite, would ever know about this. It's just kind of our little secret, like nudge, nudge, wink, wink, conspiratorially covering up the sin. But when word comes back, like David, the cat's out of the bag, there's no way we can hide a pregnancy. We know, everyone knows, my husband's been at battle. Like, people can do the math and subtract 9 months and know that something fishy is going on here. And in doing so, she kind of walks into collusion with David. Like, they would have well known the Old Testamental laws that in Judges, for instance, in chapter 20, we read that, in the law, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, we read there that if a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, doesn't that sound awfully familiar? It says, they shall certainly die, both of them. Bathsheba might not have wanted this, but she certainly didn't fight against it. She didn't do anything in the narrative that we receive to try to abstain from this wicked act. And so what we read is the wages of sin is death, and very literally here in the old covenantal living. And so it says this, that she conceived, she told David that. And so David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. Initially, it seems like, wow, David is going to own up. He's going to have the hardest imaginable conversation to have with a trusted confidant. He's going to confess. It's going to be horrible, but it's the best thing to do. Wow, I could admire that in David, to do what is right despite the high cost of walking in uprightness and in righteousness. And initially it looks good. It says, so Joab sent for Uriah, and he went to David. Uriah comes to David. There's super awkward small talk. David kind of checks in. He says, he asks how Joab was doing, how the others were doing, and how the war was going. And then David said to Uriah, how about you go down to your house just to wash your feet? If you've ever heard of a euphemism, I'm sure that is one. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. Like, David's put on Barry Manilow and sent that with them, and there's wine and chocolates and strawberries. Like, David's obviously trying to cover up his sin so that Uriah could be with his wife. Uriah here is a man of integrity. He's a good dude, a righteous man, and he doesn't fall for this trick. It says, but Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord. He did not go down to his house. Like, this guy has integrity, and let's explain why. When they told David Uriah did not go to his house, David confronts Uriah. Have you not come from a long journey? Why did you not go down to your own house? So Uriah's explanation is, the ark and Israel and Judah, they all dwell in booths. And my lord Joab and the servants of my lord, they are camping in the open field. Hey, I'm just coming fresh from battle. This is wartime. Like, this isn't time for leisure, David. And my buddies and my commander, they're all sleeping rough in the field every night after battle. And why would I go home? Like, that would be so devious of me to do that. And in doing so, Uriah here is quite obviously so much more upright and righteous than David is during this instance. Shall I then go to my house, eat, to drink, and to lie with my own wife? As you live, David, as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. Uriah is just completely adamant. I'm not doing this. This is wrong. I swear on your life. Let's get spiritual and eternal here. I swear on your soul, David. Like, this is spiritually wrong. This is eternally wrong. Literally nothing in this universe can sway me from this. I'm not going to do this wicked thing, David. Then David said to Uriah, this is like plan C in the cover-up of sin. The longer we cover up our sin, it doesn't disappear or go away or get unmade. It gets worse. We see that here with David. David said to Uriah, remain here with me today. Tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem with that day and the next. And then David invited him in, and then in his presence he drank so that he made him to be drunk. And so David here, it's just gross how low he is getting morally to try to entice Uriah into his wife so that David can hopefully cover up his sin. In the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, and he did not go to his own house. And in reading this, we find that an unintentionally drunk Uriah had more integrity than a sober David in this particular chapter, and what condemning words towards the spiritual condition of David presently, and how often do we find ourselves in very low positions as far as how well we are doing spiritually. In the morning, it says he didn't go to his house. So in the morning, David's in like plan D or something here on the cover up. It says David wrote a letter to the military commander Joab. He sent it by the hand of Uriah. David trusts Uriah's integrity so much. He sends Uriah with his own death sentence, knowing that Uriah has too much integrity to peek a look at this private letter that David has written. And it says this: send Uriah to the front line of the hardest fighting, then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. Let's not mince any words here. This is premeditated murder on behalf of David, but David is relying on Israel's enemies to kill this guy. But it's a setup, it's a ploy. And so Joab does it. As Joab was besieging the city of Rabbah, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant enemy men. And the men of the city, they came out to fight with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. So more than just Uriah dies, like there's huge collateral here that is stemmed from this initial thought process of sin that went on David's mind, and now it has snowballed. It is just growing exponentially in the ugliness of sin, in the scope of sin, and the collateral of many lives being killed simply so David can try to cover up sin, which ultimately will be a very unsuccessful bid of his. And so others are struck down. Joab sent to David all the news about the fighting. He instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling David all the news about the fighting to the king, if the king's anger arises because we made a really bad military move, if that happens, if he says, why did you go so near the city? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? And David's like quoting this well-known story that occurs in Judges chapter 9. Like, militarily speaking, it's an idiotic task to rush a walled city and to be right underneath the walls where you're at your most vulnerable and the strength of the wall is at its greatest height. And so the servant here is kind of primed to give David an answer if David is suddenly an amnesiac and forgets that he commanded this whole thing to happen. And so David, if he says that, you shall say, your servant Uriah is dead also, and hopefully you'll appease any anger of David. So the messenger went, he came, he told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us. They came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. But then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants, they are dead. And by the way, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So David says to the messenger, send this message back to Joab. Do not let this matter displease you. Like David's pretending as if it's no big deal to murder people in cold blood. For the sword devours one and then another. Like David's like conspiratorially, like they're in collusion, like, hey, like sword kills one and kills another. That's kind of the line David's feeding his men. And he's tempting these others. By the way, Joab is just like this totally unscrupulous man. And David's beckoning them into living this duplicitous life where murder is suddenly acceptable even by the king. We continue in verse 26, which says, when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead. Like, that's strong language. Bathsheba isn't named by name, but she's named in relation to her relationship with her husband, and Uriah is named, but then it's reiterated he was her legal, rightful husband. Again, the author here is not allowing us to make little of sin. One little slip up is none of that. It's like, remember when this married adulteress found out that her husband, to whom she was married, was dead, it says that she lamented for her husband. And when the morning was over, like almost immediately upon the heels of that, it says David sent and he brought her into his house and she became his wife and she bore him a son. And it's as if David's trying to recreate they lived happily ever after ending. As if David, as so often we foolishly do, is pretending as if he can cover up his sin and be successful at it. As if he can pretend that it really wasn't that big of a deal initially and he's fixed everything anyway. And so no big deal, right? And that's not how the universe works. That's not how the spiritual law of sowing and reaping works. Like that's why that spiritual law begins with the words, do not be deceived. God will not be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. David will live through so many decades of consequences, generations of consequences, because he didn't come clean, because he didn't confess a sin, rather continued to perpetuate it in his attempts to make himself look good on the exterior, while in the interior, this guy is dying. David writes about this experience, and in particular in Psalm 32, verses 3 and 4, he talks about a time when he had sinned and was pretending as if he hadn't, and he wasn't confessing it, acting as if God could be fooled. And he said, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night, speaking of the Lord, your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer." As we will cover Psalm 51 next week when David's kind of called out by the prophet, David writes in Psalm 51 during this period, "My sin was ever before me." David's pretending like he's fine, but he knows he's not. David's acting as if he's riding on success, but he knows he's living in spiritual failure. David is, he's not getting what he wants, a clean slate. Like, there's sin to be dealt with here, and ignoring sin is the worst way to deal with sin. It will grow, it will kill, it will steal, it will destroy you from the inside out, and David is learning that painful lesson as he continues to try to tamp down the truth and live in falsehood. David here is just so fascinating. What an incredible cautionary tale for us to kind of dissect. It ends, this godless chapter finally mentions the Lord and says, "But the thing that David did had displeased the Lord." Doesn't matter if David tried to marry her at the end. It doesn't matter, a life was born out of this, and all life should be celebrated. Like, it's amazing, and yet that doesn't appease God. Like, you can't just pretend to pick the one highlight of this and pretend as if there isn't sin abounding in the rest of it. And it just reminds me in a dorky way of like the NTSB, right? Like, I know you guys often think of the National Transportation Safety Board. They are in charge of the investigation of all aircraft accidents in the US and generally involved with all aircraft accidents around the world. They begin a very, very thorough, intense investigatory period that lasts at least 2 years. And the reason that they do this is twofold, as stated by them. Number one, they want to find a probable cause. And they want explanations. We all want to know why. And they do that primarily for the second and last reason of their existence as far as these investigations go, so that they can make recommendations to prevent future calamities. That, in my opinion, is why 2 Samuel exists. Not to make David look like a dirty dog, not to make ourselves look good, because I haven't killed anybody this week. I haven't slept with anyone's wife ever, so I must be doing pretty good. When we judge ourselves against the worst of humanity, of course we're going to come out looking decent. That's not what this is about. This is about us looking into what could have caused this, and how could we in our own lives make recommendations to prevent this calamity from ever happening again. As I see it, David was living in willful isolation. His army was gone. He wasn't where he should have been. He was all alone in a time of weakness. And how often, church, do we find ourselves as believers accidentally or intentionally isolated from others, without accountability, without people to shake us out of our stupor, without people to slap us when we're acting like spiritual amnesiacs, just acting in madness instead of remembering who we are in Jesus Christ? And what we find here is God's people never survive in isolation. In fact, no one survives in isolation. The U.S. military is pretty famous for having this sort of dogma or doctrine. It's published in the Navy journals. It is part of the foundational doctrines of the Marine Corps that isolation is key. They play these war games to test out their strategies, and what they have found here and written papers about is that if you can isolate your enemy, cut them off from help and supply lines, you're guaranteed to win 10 out of 10 times. It's that simple to take out an isolated enemy. This is exactly what our enemy wants to do with us, spiritually speaking. Isolate, no accountability, no friendship, no real friends who will ask us the hard questions. And when we get to that point as believers, we are guaranteed to fail. Even if there's partial isolation militarily, you still have an 80% success rate. Only when there's no isolation is it a toss-up, 50-50, you don't know who's going to win. And so we see that isolation is key, not only in this world's battles, but in our spiritual battles with the enemy as well. When David tried acting as a lone wolf, he's king, he's got success, and he's got pomp and circumstance following him, and he's living for his own self-centeredness because he's kind of this one-man show, we see him fall. Humans In particular, God's people, we are not meant to live as lone wolves. Ironically, that's just such an idiotic misnomer. Like, wolves don't even operate as lone wolves. The University of Utah, in conjunction with Yellowstone, they have done multiple studies on wolf hunts and wolf packs and the interconnectedness of these packs, and found that lone wolves, they do not have success. Lone wolves die alone. They're not successful. I don't know why they're glamorized. Only when wolves hunt in conjunction with the pack do they see the success rates skyrocket. And so what we see here is being a lone wolf doesn't work for God's people. It quite literally doesn't even work for lone wolves. And so when we think we're strong, and when we think we're capable, and when we think we're self-sufficient, then we are most idiotically playing into the hand of the evil one so that he can snuff us out. He can use the advantage of isolation and let us as believers be real with one another. Be in a church, not just so you can attend, but that you're interdependent, that you are accountable. People know you, not just the great you that you want the world to see, but the real you of struggles and of heartache and of slip-ups. And if we're really the church, those people who know that, they will love you more in the love of Christ. This intimate knowledge is not something to run away from and to be afraid of, but rather it's something that makes us stronger together. In this chapter, David didn't get that, and so he did not receive the help that comes along with that. And so I want to jump in closure to 1 Corinthians 10, verses 12 and 13. The church of Corinth, they just live in infamy. They were hands down the most dysfunctional church of the New Testament. They tried making very little of sin, and it cost them dearly too. Paul is writing to these people, speaking particularly about sin and ongoing sin and our response to it. And his encouragement to them begins like this in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12. Therefore, if anyone thinks that he stands, take heed lest he fall. Paul here is saying the same thing spiritually. Don't be isolated. You're an utter fool if you think you can operate as a lone wolf and still be a member of the church. That's not congruent. Take heed. That word means be alert, be vigilant, like be almost like a little bit nervous of failure, like this healthy, self-preserving fear. Like wake up, recognize that you were created to be not only dependent upon God, but interdependent upon God's church that he has placed you within. Continuing on, hoping that we don't fall, he says, on the other hand, recognize that no temptation has overtaken you that is common to man. And so what Paul here is saying is that overtaken word is interesting. It means to lay hold of. I think of like a heel grasp in wrestling. You're just getting this foothold on the enemy, and that's this picture that Paul's using of sin. Like, you need to understand, like, you might have done some gnarly stuff. David did some gnarly stuff. It doesn't undermine God's love for you. It doesn't overwhelm God so that he backs off. He unconditionally loves you, and maybe we need to explore the term unconditional love again. And so Paul is saying it's normal for people to do this. That doesn't mean it's acceptable, but it's normal. Sin does this to people. It clings, it grabs, it tries to trip you up. And this is common. On a human level, this is where we are at. And recognizing our broken state, our depravity of without God, it is common for me to sin. It is common for me to just go mad with lust and to run after all the pleasures of this world. That's normal for humanity, but we're not normal humanity if we are redeemed by Christ and indwelled by his Holy Spirit. Thus, he continues, God is faithful. We have an advocate, a helper, a redeemer, and this triune God is for us comprehensively. And we need to recognize even when we are faithless, God remains faithful to us. We can always count on God, even in seasons of temptation. It says he will not let you be tempted beyond, which means over and above, your ability. God will not let you be tempted over and above your ability. That word ability is translated as power. You have power in the Spirit of Jesus Christ. You have power in your new identity and your standing as a child of God who is redeemed through faith, giving you salvation. And Paul reminds us of our identity. You were not made for sin. You were not made for leisure time. You were not made for pleasure and gratification. You were made for a relationship with God. David learns that running after sin, it doesn't satisfy it. It doesn't even meet its promises and expectations, and it comes with a whole lot of baggage that is just coincidentally left out upon its promises. Only God himself can satisfy us. And C.S. Lewis has this quote that goes something along the lines of, if I find within myself desires that nothing in this world can satisfy, the only conclusion I can come up with is that I was not made for this world. How often do we run after sin, hoping to be satisfied and only to be left worse than before? Does that not just point us towards an everlasting, eternal, incomprehensible God that is finally something big enough to satisfy us for all time? It says, in the temptation, God will also provide a way of escape. There is always a way out of sin. There is never sin which we can just say, I had no choice. That doesn't happen. That's inexcusable. We know that God in his faithfulness, he gives us ways out. Will we run away from sin rather than running mindlessly towards sin? He says he does that so that we may be able to endure it. This is God's will for us, to endure sin. That word endure is a Greek compound word. It means to bear under a weight. Like we can lift this, we can carry it. This is not too heavy for us to bear. This is something that in the power of God, as we walk in the will of Christ, we can bear. We can live a victorious life. And so Anthem, as we take a week before we get into the repentance and restoration of Jesus, I want to ask you that question. Are you living at peace with sin in your life? If so, do you recognize that sin is actively seeking to destroy you? It's not living at peace with you, even if you think you are living at peace with that sin. Do you recognize that God hates sin so much that he sent his son to die for the very sins that you and I commit? He abhors sin. It is detestable to him. There's no way around the fact that sin and God are not compatible. And are you making too little of sin in your life, watering it down, trying to put makeup on the corpse of sin and saying, well, it's really not that bad. It's just lapse of judgment. It's just a minor thing. There's no victims here. As we make excuses, we need to recognize that we are walking away from the truth of God and choosing to believe in our self-made falsehoods. Anthem, we need to recognize the sober fact that God is displeased with our sin. He still loves us. He is still faithful to us. That doesn't undermine our salvation standing in Christ, but it certainly comes with consequences. It comes with immediate and sometimes long-lasting consequences of sin and destruction and heartache, and it's all unneeded. Let's take this week, Anthem, to reread this verse, to pour into Psalm 32, to read Proverbs 7, and to soberly think through, are we allowing sin to enter in through the back door of our lives? And may we use David as a cautionary tale to remind us of the high price of sin. Thank you, and we'll see you next week. Bye.